Welcome everyone to the session Infographics Bootcamp with Dr. Sara Dong. Dr. Sara Dong is a renowned physician and academic, a combined adult and pediatric infectious disease fellow at Beth Israel Medical Center and Boston Children's Hospital. She earned her medical degree from the Medical University of South Carolina and completed her internal medicine and pediatrics residency and chief residency at Ohio State University Medical Center and Nationwide Children's Hospital. She was Met Chief Resident and did an additional Chief Resident year for the Nationwide Children's Hospital Pediatric Residency Program. She also completed Rapkin Fellowship in Medical Education at Beth Israel Medical Center with Harvard Medical School. Dr. Dong is also a recognized leader in digital education. She has been instrumental in the development of numerous digital tools and educational resources for medical students, residents, and practicing physicians. She's the creator of a Febrile podcast. This podcast uses consult questions to dive into infectious disease clinical reasoning, diagnostics, and antimicrobial management. One of Dr. Dong's expertise in digital education are infographics. She has created more than 100 infographics to teach the world all about the ins and outs of infectious disease. And today, we're honored to be learning from the expert herself on how to create infographics on Canva as she shares with us her tips and tricks. With that, a very warm welcome to Dr. Dong. It's a pleasure to have you with us here tonight.
Thanks. Thank you for introducing me. It's so great to meet everyone. And you guys have such an awesome group of everyone is like at a different place in their training. But the goal for this is really to just give an introduction to infographics. And I think there will be plenty of time at the end where we can talk through things or anyone can ask questions. But hopefully you'll find this helpful. And I have given this talk in different formats before, and I like to open with saying sort of what is the challenge of infographics. And I think one of our challenges as medical educators is how do we teach and disseminate information when you have a very time limited clinical learning environment. And so creating and using digestible visual summaries like infographics is a great tool to overcome that challenge. And the CardioNerds, obviously, as fellows or chiefs in the group, you already recognize the potential of these types of communication. So I don't really have to focus on that too much. But I think many find the jump from doing sort of the typical slideshows or tables to newer communications like infographics and visual abstracts seeming sort of more intimidating than I think they need to be. And so I hope that this encourages you and inspires you to think creatively, to create awesome things, both for you to learn topics and for you to share them with others. And this skill set really enhances how you can educate and communicate. And that could be with your co-fellows, it could be with other healthcare professionals. And depending on your sort of goals, it may be working with patients or working sort of public facing. And then I think as a sort of side note to this as well, it's a really great way to share your scientific work, whatever that might be, if it's medical education, if it's basic science research, if it's clinical research. And, I just like to introduce the term of infographics and what does it really mean. To me, I think infographic is just a way to say any visual representation of information or data using some combination of text and charts and images. And so these are really made to inform others, but I think if used correctly, you can use them as sort of a way to engage someone in the content as well. And so we're not going to dive too much into theory, but I think sometimes mentioning some of the sort of principles that underline why infographics work is useful. And this is quite simple, but people learn better when they are presented with words and pictures rather than words alone. And so to me, I think a great visual helps us interpret complex information more quickly. So I've broken this up. It's listed as 10 tips and tools, but it's sort of a roadmap to how I start thinking about infographics and sort of the resources that you might use and the strategies that might help you get started, particularly if you haven't done many infographics before. And number one that I like to start with is the fact that crystal clear content is most important. At the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is whatever message it is that you're communicating. And so I think the first step before you do anything is to try to think about what is your goal, really sitting down and saying, what is this information gap I want to fill? Am I summarizing some sort of information? Am I comparing and contrasting? Am I showing a process? And it may be that this is oriented around a podcast episode that has already been created and that may answer itself pretty quickly. But if you're starting more with a general topic, it may be a little bit harder to refine that. And so you really need to sit with it and have that ready before you jump in. And I think as part of that, you start to define what is your message and your take home points for whoever looks at your graphic. You should be able to know and articulate what those are, and someone else should be able to independently look at your graphic and essentially do the same thing. Hopefully, that would be the goal. Um, and then I think you have to remember who is your audience, and you're really generally creating these with some sort of quote end user in mind. And I think in medical education type infographics, that's important because you're trying to know where, which learner is going to be able to benefit from this. And sometimes you'll make things that cross various levels of training or expertise, but it may be that you are making something for a very specific audience. And that's going to dictate what is important to include, what are the pieces that you can remove. And so you have your message, you figured out what your key takeaway points are. And then I have this very blank slide to say organize, because organization is key. And I'd say the things that I generally do is starting from the basics and planning it out by sometimes even writing it down with pen and paper. And generally what I recommend is to start by taking your content and thinking about what might be your headings or sections of the graphic. And then it may be that you sort of handwrite in, oh, I want an image of this in this section to complement the text. And so it may take you a couple times to walk through that to know what is the best design for whatever topic you're talking about, or that might come together a bit more easily. And, I always think that as you get more comfortable with this, exactly how much pre-planning you need to do may change. I probably, for example, draft out a little bit less discreetly now than I did in the beginning. But that's one of the challenges is how much of a topic do you include in one infographic? And so we'll show you some examples here as we go along. I think the other part of drafting it out is you might realize, whoa, I kind of have too much content for one visual. How can I break this up into 2 or 3 graphics instead to have more impact on each of the individual sections? And then as you do that, the other component would be what considerations for the actual sort of physical dimensions of the graphic. I say physical, but they're digital. But if you know exactly where you plan to post it, for example, it's going to go on Twitter, it may be that you want to select dimensions that are specifically made for a Twitter post. Same with Instagram or any other sort of platform. If you know someone's going to view it on their phone primarily, what is the dimensions that would fit that best? And so there's a lot of that that's built into infographic makers, but you can also search those online. And so those will go into what type of files you use and sort of the shape of the graphic. So we're going to look at a couple examples. I like to show these infographic varieties as a way to give some insight into the different styles that might be out there and how you might approach it. And you can hopefully keep these in mind as you start formulating graphics. But I'm going to start with informational, which is what most people probably think of when they hear the word infographic. Generally, they're simplistic or quick overviews of whatever topic. So these are from the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics, have some nice visuals, but overall, pretty limited amount of information on there. But you can have summary graphics that have a lot more content. So I've pulled a couple CardioNerds examples as we go through. And so you can see here the range of what would sort of fall into an informational graphic might be very different. But this is generally what most, for example, podcast platforms are doing, is summarizing information from certain episodes or certain topics. Another great example of creating successful infographics is ones that use the power of sort of a flow diagram or some sort of process. So the one here on the left is from penicillin allergy and congenital syphilis here on the right, which you can tell is my bias because I'm an infectious disease person. But this chart that's on the right looks a little busy, but it actually summarizes like a whole textbook chapter into one page, which is why it's been very useful to consolidate a lot of information. But there's other forms of this. This is a really nice one from Core IM on hyponatremia. And then the one on the right is actually meant to be a visual summary, kind of like an abstract for a diabetes paper. And then there's several examples of great flow diagrams on the CardioNerds library of graphics. These are conceptually much easier to draft out beforehand, right? If you're figuring it out. But these can be a little bit more tedious as you put them into the infographic maker. So it's very nice to have these handwritten. I didn't ask who created these, but I suspect they probably drafted out a lot of this before they plugged it into their infographic maker. You can compare and contrast. So this is one that looks at CMV prevention strategies in solid organ transplant. This is one that I have for febrile that is sort of borrowed from a table that's in some of our guidelines. And, compare and contrast may be quite simple, but there are ways that you can bring in the visual piece that make it eye-catching. These are both from the CDC, and I thought are kind of nice examples. But they also can be a little bit more complex. This is a really nice example on the right side of some compare and contrast. There's also a bit of a flow diagram here on the left. And so you may end up using a combination of things as you create these graphics. And that's totally okay. But thinking about how can you present a lot of information in a small amount of sort of time or space, these are great strategies. And then it goes without saying that infographics can summarize a lot of information as far as big numbers. And a lot of the programs are made to help you present a large or sort of complex amount of data. And depending on what it is that you want to talk about, you may be able to take advantage of things like these little people person charts down here on the left, which, we don't tend to use much in a lot of our other sort of general medical presentations, but I think work really well in infographics. All right. And then visual abstracts, which I, in my mind, link these under infographics, but they do sort of have a specific purpose and I would say importance in medical education. And many of you who've probably submitted publications recently know that many journals are at this point starting to require these. And I think even if they aren't, being able to make your own is a really great way to sort of promote your work. And there's a couple great resources on pre-made templates and ways to get started for visual abstracts specifically. And if you remind me, I have some of those links that I can send to everyone. But before I get there, and then, I kind of mentioned this before, but there have been several studies now looking at how these visual abstracts really do increase how much engagement you're getting with the publication. And so this is just to be a bit meta and show you a visual abstract talking about that topic. But I was just going to mention that the CardioNerds have tons of experience with this, right? Of taking major trials and major papers and presenting them in graphics and visual abstracts that you share in your community and with others. And so I think you have tons of great references if you go through the CardioNerds library of how this can be done well and creatively and in different styles and formats. All right. And then I have an other section. Um, I think that there are a lot of graphics that don't necessarily fall into these groups. And many infographics, in my mind, can be a bit complex and not necessarily a quick read that you glance at on your phone. And I think a really good example of this are the one pagers from Nick Mark. And this is one on shock. but many of you have probably seen these or gone to his website. And you can see that these are huge, like textbook topics that are a ton of information that are distilled into one-page sheets that you can quickly look at. And to me, this is still an infographic. And similarly, there's other examples of this, I'd say, through the CP solvers, for example, all of their diagnostic schemas, their illness scripts, and these graphics also fall into informational graphics, sometimes with flow charts. Sometimes they're handwritten, or maybe more, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of edited as the examples here, like the insulin and the hemolytic anemias. And I picked this as an example too, to show that if you think about your audience for a lot of these graphics, that's going to inform what types of abbreviations you use, which types of sort of grouping of information that you do. So for this, you have to have some medical background to follow a lot of this, but it's a great resource that takes a ton of information and puts it on one page. And, I show that example and my example because you'll see this is by far the most popular thing I've ever made. And there's basically no visuals in it. And it's because there was not a compare and contrast chart on fungal markers for ID fellows or for trainees in general. And at this point, it's actually been like peer reviewed by a couple people. And I in ID, I don't have the luxury sometimes of having pictures or flow diagrams, so I'm kind of stuck putting a lot of words in graphics, which I thought would be a big disadvantage. But if you do it well and you really think about the content that you're trying to share, your audience is going to appreciate it if it is meeting those goals, regardless of what images you're able to put in it. Obviously, it's nice to have something that's eye-catching or colorful, but there are ways to do that subtly while still focusing on your content. So these next couple ones, I'm just going to talk a little bit about thinking about the structure of your graphic and how you can make small choices that have it easier to read as your sort of end user, as I mentioned earlier. And the first thing is simplicity and unity. And this, I think, goes without saying and is something that we all strive for, but it's a bit difficult. And so I put a couple examples here on just structural things that may be quite obvious. For example, this one, people learn better if you don't have too many words and pictures. So this is a bad example of a daptomycin slide. Tons of extraneous information, it's distracting, and you don't really know where to look. But there's also other things that may not immediately come to mind. And this is a really great example of something that I didn't really learn as well until later. People actually learn better if you put the words near the area of the graphic that you're talking about rather than separately. So on the left here, you can see the lobes and areas of the brain that are labeled right next to the diagram arrow versus having a small key on the bottom here on the right. So subtle things that may take a little bit of work or difference as you create it, but are going to make it much easier to digest down the road. And then separately from that, I think that you may be trying to consider how to use hierarchy and sequence in your graphic. Meaning you can try to show relative importance with lines or borders or shapes. And I always recommend that people think about a typical English reader, if they look at your graphic, are going to start in the top left corner and read across and end in the bottom right. And if that's not how your visual flow is meant to be, you're probably going to have to do some sort of indicators to make sure that they know to look in a certain spot. And so I think that if you feel that you are a bit more design challenged or don't feel like that is your strength, you can use all of the templates that are available in infographic makers that take a lot of these sort of design and structure pieces out of your brain a little bit so that you can focus on the content. And I mentioned this already, that hopefully you'll be able to use things like I mentioned, like arrows or highlights to signal what is the most important information. and templates are your friend. And if we have time, we can talk a little bit more about thinking about how to adjust templates. Okay. And I hope that most of you by now have logged in or used Canva before. That's generally what I would recommend as far as an infographic maker, meaning the program that you plug things into that ultimately spits out whatever your final visual infographic is. That said, on the left here, you can still use PowerPoint and Google Slides. And then on the right side, it may be that you do things as simple as writing on a tablet. And I think that ultimately it really doesn't matter what you use as long as you get comfortable with it and you practice. Um, and so I have some resources that talk about lots of different web infographic makers. There are tons of other programs that are similar to Canva. Most of them have a free version. I do think that there is no reason you should ever have to pay a penny to make any of these graphics. You do not need the pro version or a subscription. You can create all of these for free. The one thing I'll point out is if you are working towards more of a scientific poster, infographic, visual abstract, things like BioRender, which is focused a bit more on science graphics and sort of basic science images that you might not get on things like Canva, are a useful resource, but they tend to have a limited amount of things that you can do for free. That said, if you're at a major sort of academic place or have an affiliated university, sometimes they'll have some sort of institutional account that you can sign up for. But I do know that you can't sort of do everything that you normally would in BioRender without some sort of subscription. Okay. Next, I have color. We're not going to talk about color theory and, matching complementary colors. I think all you really need to remember is that you can use color purposefully. You can try to highlight things with it. You can synchronize different components of your graphic by using color. And in general, you're probably going to be most successful if you limit the number of colors in the graphic. I don't think there's a perfect number necessarily, but if you're using it to demonstrate linkages and emphasis, generally you're not going to want too many because then your learner's not going to know what they're supposed to be focused on. And, another important thing that I like to point out that hopefully you already think about, but it's the readability of text. And I mean that in a couple different ways. It might be that it's the color contrast component, meaning the background of your the background layer and the color of your text. And so there are a lot of resources online that can help you pick complementary color schemes without getting into color theory. So that's nice. But generally, if you're going to use something like Canva, it's likely going to do a lot of that for you or suggest colors to you. So I think unless you're trying to promote a certain color palette for your program, like for example, for Febra, I use a lot of the same colors to sort of reinforce the theme. But I think otherwise, you can generally rely on what's in the infographic maker. And then there are resources that you can actually put in the colors of your background and your foreground or your text and see if you have enough contrast. And there also is another version of this where you can see what your graphic would look like with different levels of color blindness. So particularly if you have graphs that are comparing, for example, like two bar graphs, making sure that those are two opposing colors that someone's actually going to be able to see the difference is quite important. So if you don't have a friend to ask or someone to look over your colors, you can use a lot of these online resources as least sort of one layer of sort of checking how the color scheme and the color contrast works. All right. And then what I'd say most people are most excited about usually is how do we include images and icons? And there are tons of options. They're mostly built into your infographic maker. And visual elements usually come in two flavors. So there are those that are not necessarily relevant to the information that you're presenting, meaning if you remove them, they could interpret all the information without it, but they're there to sort of draw someone in, or engage your audience. And so these are two examples of ones that I have images in that they don't really actually impact the text that's in the graphic. And these are these beautiful Avengers graphics, right? That are meant to catch your attention and then have a very refined amount of information next to them. So I think this is a really good example of graphics that draw people in. The other piece of it is that you may have graphics that are directly related to the information, meaning it's critical for you to see, for example, an anatomic drawing, which I think in cardiology you guys would use all the time. Um, or another example would be someone who is talking about a location that really needs a map. And so there's generally a mix of the different types of images that you'll need in graphics. And I would say, in general, the more that you can lean towards the second one, meaning the icons or images are directly replacing text or supplementing text, are certainly the most valuable. And if you're not sure, you can go back again to that North Star and say, does this help me accomplish the goal of this graphic? Does it help me communicate my message? And sometimes that answer you realize is, even though I really like this image, it might be distracting. And I think that another good way to have a sense of if an image is helpful is to, again, ask a friend. I've definitely had graphics where I showed it to someone and I was so pleased. I loved the visual that was in it. And they pointed out, like, you really don't need that one picture of the blood culture bottle. So I had to take it out. So I think that's a really great way to sort of check yourself, is asking a friend. And I would always make sure that the clarity of any icon or image in your graphic is as close to um, clear as you can get it, I guess I should say. This is from a really great paper that if you haven't checked out, I would highly recommend. It's quite short. It's called Comic Sans or Common Sense. But this is a really great example of thinking about clarity. And so generally, in infographic makers, they're made to take this headache out. But I think all of us remember using PowerPoint and trying to adjust an image, and you distort the aspect ratio, and it becomes blurry or it becomes harder to look, harder to visualize. And so that's the goal: is if you really like an image but it's blurry or it's distorted, I really would encourage you to try to find some alternate if you can. And sometimes that's not possible, but generally you can find some sort of example to hold its place. And these are some examples of resources. I mentioned your infographic program. If you have ever used this, if you just type in noun project into Google, it'll bring up a page that you can free text into their search bar different words, and it'll bring the very simplistic icons that you might see in a PowerPoint presentation or in an infographic. Noun project's kind of nice because sometimes they have a couple more um, medical oriented things than Canva. And sometimes I'll use it to get inspiration for what I should search for in Canva. So if I am like struggling with how to create or find an image that would simplify a topic, sometimes I'll try searching it in different programs just to see if that brings up a better example. And then Flat Icon is another similar icon repository that you could look through or search. Certainly for visual abstracts, for example, you may be just taking actual key figures. So generally you can do that through screenshot or snipping tool, that depending on, if you're using a PC or a Mac. I don't use a ton of stock photos, but there are a lot of people who do like them. And sometimes you may be able to use portions of a stock photo. So Pixabay and Pexels are two examples of places where they're focused a bit more on actual photograph type images, or, for example, a background image that has, I don't know, like school supplies on it, or something like that. If you needed something that was a bit more generic to serve as a background, you might be able to find that in Pixabay or Pexels. That said, Canva now has tons of photos as well, so I don't know that I generally have to go check these out, but perhaps in other settings outside of using Canva, like if you're using PowerPoint, that might have some good resources for you. And then I encourage you to think about if there is something that you can't find, to try your hand at drawing. There are a lot of apps now that are free that you can use on your phone just with your finger or a stylus. Or if you're lucky enough to have a tablet, there are lots of programs. That one icon is Procreate. That is a paid app, but there's a lot of free versions. And so sometimes if there's a topic that you can't quite capture with other graphics or combinations of other visuals from things like Canva, you might think about drawing. And so I've done that on some graphics. And then I put AI because I think down the road there probably will be a role for that. I don't know what that is yet. I'm sure many of you have played around with like putting in fun collections of words into the AI photo generators, but maybe one day that will be something that can help us. All right, we're getting to number 7. I don't know if anyone has seen this SNL skit. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to check it out. Um, I put this here because your selection for font or the style or appearance of text can take someone from, being bored or disinterested at its sort of least worrisome to very angry or disinterested at its extreme, which is shown here by Ryan Gosling. And some of the things that have to do with text are a bit intuitive, meaning the less words you have, trying to use bullet points are useful. You may not be able to do that, but obviously prioritizing brevity where you can is useful. Generally, I would recommend using 3 or less fonts. And if you're creating a graphic, say for CardioNerds, or you're creating it for your program, and maybe that there are fonts that you already have sort of designated as your style, as your preferred font. And I think that's a really nice way to take some of the guesswork out of it. Generally, I would use bold for emphasis, and I'd say most people will suggest avoiding excessive italics and underlining. Um, I think there's a variety of opinions on this, and you can sort of do with it what you want. But I would say my personal advice is I usually prefer doing bold to emphasize something. And then I recommend that you think about tracking, so the space between letters and words, and spacing, so the spacing between the individual lines of text in a paragraph. And I'm sure you all, again, have been in a word processing document and had challenges with this. But sometimes when you're cramped for space on an infographic, you might sort of like the fact that you can put things very close together. And you just have to be very careful that when you take a step back or have someone else look at it, that you still have a lot of space and um, blank area between uh, groups of text or images so that people can easily visualize everything. And then I think the other piece of text that, again, some of this is debated, but most people would recommend the sans serif fonts, meaning it doesn't have those little extra wings on it. So you can see there on the bottom right versus the bottom left. The serif fonts were designed for printed work, so like newspapers, and they're meant to be sort of easier for your eyes to follow, that the little serifs would sort of guide you to the next letter. But I'd say the general consensus is that sans serif fonts are better for online viewing, which is generally how people are going to be looking at your infographics. Um, so if you are looking at it and you're on the fence, these might be tips and tricks that you can use. But ultimately, I think a lot of this is there's some gray space here for what is critical and what is sort of just stylistic. And so this is another example from that paper I mentioned about some of the things we just talked about in typography, but also going back to structure from that earlier in our sort of 10 steps. Here you can see that on the right, it's not only that they change the type of font, but they use font and I should say typography to their advantage to highlight how people should look through the document or the infographic, I'm sorry, and sort of the hierarchy of this is the heading and the subheading and simplifying the images here. So just a really great example of how you can really transform the same amount of information into something that's much easier to read and clear to your reader as far as what is the most valuable information they should take away. All right. And number 8 is publish. Obviously, you want to share your work, but I recommend that you share before and after you quote publish. And publish could mean putting it on social media. It might be putting it on the website itself. It might be part of a formal publication. But the more eyes that you have that look at it with different perspectives, the more feedback that you'll get. And, I encourage you to think about having 2 people, or this might be 1 person, depending on how much experience they have, to give you feedback. 1 person that gives you feedback on the content. Is it clear? Is it cohesive? Uh, did they take home the same messages that you wanted them to? So the actual sort of content in the page, but then also having someone else who looks at it just from a visual standpoint. Is the layout good? Do you think the colors work well? Is there anything on the images that's distracting? And so sometimes you're probably going to have people who can give you that granular feedback separately. And it might be that you actually prefer to give one that is sort of your quote content expert to look at something while you ask another colleague to be your sort of visual feedback person. So I think that the nice thing with CardioNerds is you guys have a really great network, and this is built into your experience. But even after you're sort of graduated from the fellowship, the academy, I think you can still do this with your colleagues at work, even people who don't make a lot of infographics, because they don't need to make them to be able to tell you how they were able to gain information from it and how it worked for them. Number 9 is please make sure to, I say brand it, meaning put your name on it. You spent a lot of time on it and you should be really proud of it. But I think the flip side of that's true if you are using information from something else or taking visuals, make sure that you credit and cite them appropriately. And this is something that I think you'll get used to, and hopefully people will remind you if you forgot to make sure to put your name on it. But particularly with social media, I think it's a really good way to make sure that sort of your handiwork has your branding on it. And my last piece of advice is just to get started. You do not need to be good at art. I think the most common thing people say to me is, I can't do infographics because I'm not a visual person. But I really don't think that that has anything to do with it. It has to do with the content that you're trying to teach. And you can build that with the help of your friends that are with you in the academy, but also the things that are built into your infographic maker. And over time, these will become more natural to you. And so I will end with another challenge to say that as you get better and better at infographics, how can you think about ways to sort of level up and get to Infographics 201? The nice thing is CardioNerds, you already have an infographic library, but if you create a lot of information, make sure that you have those for yourself. And also, if you see other people's graphics that inspire you or that you like to use to teach, to make sure to build those into your library as well, so that when you're on the go and you're on rounds, you can grab those and share them with others. And I think I've kind of mentioned this along the way, as you work towards making these graphics for yourself, think about that component of identity or branding. So it might be that you end up using a similar color scheme or collection of fonts and sort of styles that will help kind of put a signature on your graphics. And that may not be something that you want, but I'd say for things like podcasts, sometimes that's actually quite helpful for giving people a sense of products that came from that same sort of community, that digital community who made it. And so that might be putting on the CardioNerds brand, or it might be if you're on a separate project or you're working with another group, that you have some sort of indicator of that. Certainly trying to learn some advanced features or try new software is always a bit fun. There's tons of do-it-yourself tutorials online, and if there's something that you really see in another graphic that you want to learn, if I don't know things, I search them up and try to teach them myself. And I think you can do the same. And it's a really nice way over time to also make it fun to be creative and sort of branch out from the graphics you've been creating. Um, and again, collaborating and supporting others, I think, is part of this. And I think it will make your graphics stronger as you get feedback and you give feedback to others. And think about how you can incorporate it into your teaching. So I think yeah, that's my last slide.
Wow, this was really, really great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dong, for, sharing all these tips with us. I find this very helpful myself, and I'm sure everyone appreciates it. And I'm excited that we got this recorded because so many people were not able to attend tonight, but are excited to watch this. I loved so many parts. One of my very favorites was at the beginning when you said start with drafting with a pen and paper.
Mhm.
And this is exactly like what we were told when I first joined the academy is like just get it on a piece of paper, on the iPad, whatever you want, just draft it. Just kind of an outline of what you think or how you think the information should be laid out on a paper. And that could be done once and twice and thrice until you get
Mhm.
the vision that you really want or how you envision the infographic to be, appropriately before trying to plug it in into any, Canva, for example, is what we're using.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very important starting point, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I have all these notepads on my desk, like the just general pads that I'll just write ideas and draft it out, like you were saying, different iterations. The other thing I'll sometimes do is if you like not Google Forms, Google Docs a lot, as you get more used to it, particularly if it's table or text based, I'll build it out in Google Docs and move it around, and then I won't plug it into Canva until I'm basically done. Um, I actually looked to see if I had some examples of drafts and then I could show you the end product, but I think I got rid of usually I get rid of the drafts when I have finished, so I didn't have a good example.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a great way to start. I'll open up the space for others if anyone has a question.
So I have a comment. Like this was really fantastic, Dr. Dong. I personally learned a lot from your talk, and I think your PowerPoint was speaking like it's each slide was like speaking of each of the 10 points you're talking about, and it was the best example of how to be effective in delivering the simple yet a clear and effective message. So yeah, just like to thank you again for this fantastic talk.
Thanks. And I put a link in the chat that I still am working with it because I used to have this toolkit that I would give people after workshops. So you may have to forgive a couple parts of it that I need to edit, but it's a Notion page that basically has links to everything that we talked about, meaning like some of the files as far as infographic, uh other options like bio render, and then like tools for fonts and tools for looking for icons. And so it's kind of been a work in progress. So please ignore a couple of the lines that are off, but I think over the course of the next couple of days I'll fix up the couple remaining things. But I also have the like color palette generators, so you guys can feel free to use those.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing. I think there's a question in the chat from Shelly asking, like how to have the content validated. I think she was referring to one pagers. I think if they
Yeah.
aren't viewed, how do you know they're correct and like have the content validated?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we don't totally know yet. Like how do we have quality indicators for infographics and um validate that they are based on facts? And some of that I think is learning a little bit about who's creating them and do they come from a source that you trust. And so I'd say most of, for example, the major podcast platforms are good reliable sources, but maybe individuals that you don't really know what they're sending information from. I think it's true of sort of mis and disinformation in general. Like you probably could find them in infographics. I think that I hope that we'll be able to think about quality markers and like how do we get people to sort of peer review graphics over time. But I admit there's not a easy way to find that for ones that you weren't sort of part of the production process. But I think, for example, what you're doing through the academy is the best way to try and combat that and create a resource that people know that they can come to and trust. May not initially help you as far as looking at someone else's, but I think it's a step in the right direction until we figure out what's the right way to identify sort of safe resources.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you said, in the academy, we have like at least 4 people look over any
Yeah.
info, before have it like reviewed multiple times and edited before we kind of publish them. Adriana, you have a question?
Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge, Dr. Dong. It's been so useful. My question is, for example, in your case, you have published many infographics. How do you keep record of all of them? For example, we use Google Scholar to keep record of our articles or CID, but how do you do it for your infographics?
Yeah. I again don't know the best way to do it. I do make sure that anyone who creates them for Febrile, or if I work with, so I do some of the digital education teaching sometimes for the residents, and I make sure that they put either their some sort of handle versus email on things. I for Febrile have the sort of library that I created. I can put an author. It, of course, doesn't link back to more sort of traditional forms of scholarship and authorship in the normal way. But I do everything in my power to try and make sure that when it is put out there and someone clicks on it or downloads it, that they have a way to know who created it, which is why I think it's so important that you put your name on the actual graphic, because at the end of the day, things get shared and sent through, email or Twitter or something else. And the best way that you can combat that is to have your name or, sign that you were the author and who edited it. And CardioNerds, you guys are going to do that. And I've seen that on lots of your graphics. But I think you just have to do the best you can as far as some of the other places, because I'm not sure I have a great solution for how we can always get it back to the author. So it's kind of definitely a negative. For example, there's a lot of times where people will send me places where graphics have been, which is like super exciting, but there's no way that would have gotten back to me if someone hadn't like sent a picture or like sent some sort of information. So maybe down the road there will be a better solution. Or if you guys have other ideas, please tell me. So
Yeah, that was a good question and good answer. I think Shivani.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a helpful talk. I have never made an infographic, but I have made PowerPoints, and I usually
Mhm.
use memes. That's like my way of getting people to pay attention. So I was wondering what your opinion is on the role of humor in infographics, and is there a space for that? And have you seen any successfully kind of incorporate humor?
Yeah. I think if it's done well, that you totally can lean into humor or puns or things that are sort of creative and outside of the box. I think we probably don't do that in medicine enough. As long as it's not at the expense of anyone. And I think that generally with most of the infographics and like the material you're talking about, you probably wouldn't do that. But I do think there's space for that to have a little bit of fun with things. As long as it's clear that the only thing I'll say is making sure that it's sort of a separate entity. Meaning if you have like a little bubble that's meant to be a joke, that it's clear that it is, so that people don't get confused on like what parts of your graphic are real or not real. So usually if you're just making some sort of statement that doesn't necessarily have to do with information, I think that's the best way. I'm trying to think of a good example. I probably don't use enough humor in mine. I have one where like it was about like fish poisonings, and I wrote official and I put a fish in it. Like I think you can do little things like that that are kind of fun and um don't necessarily impact how people look at the graphic and sort of lose, your sense of what's most important. Hopefully, I don't know that answered your question.
No, that did. Thank you.
I love the idea of having the joke in like a bubble or something,
Yeah.
separate what is serious and what is not.
Yeah.
I think Shelly raised her hand and then Ronaldo. So Shelly.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. So I'm associate editor for Journal of Cardiac Failure as well as the European Heart Journal. And I would say all scientific journals now treat that central illustration from a manuscript like an infographic.
Mhm.
It's becoming increasingly important in terms of the reach of articles as well. So I can't stress enough how important having this skill set is, or knowing somebody with this skill set, to enhance your manuscript, because the altmetric score goes up when you have a great figure that
Mhm.
people want to share on social media. It really is essential these days, and it does impact whether or not it's that it's looked at or sent for major revisions, right? Just based on the visual appeal of that figure. So remember that it's not about bar graphs, it's not about Kaplan-Meier curves.
Yeah.
It's about that central illustration. And all of these infographics, if you are generating them, I would say definitely place them in a section of your CV called knowledge translation. Because again, the reach is very broad. It's to colleagues, it's to the public as well, if it's on social media. And take credit for them, absolutely. If you have to create your own website and store your productivity on that, then do it. But it will translate to some form of metrics that likely will enhance academic promotion in the future. Great session tonight.
I love that. I will say, if you demonstrate that you are that person, I have definitely been invited to help with things because they needed someone to help with the main illustration. And I'll just put this second Notion page is how I put our graphics for Febrile, because I originally had them on the website, but wanted it to be a little bit easier to navigate. And I put this on my CV because I have a bunch of graphics.
Thank you so much, Professor Zaret, for sharing this. You're right. I was wondering also, like, how can we add this under our CV? So that's a great point. And thank you, Dr. Dong, for kind of for this great answer. Ronaldo?
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was very, very, very important. I think the part that I struggle the most is like picturing, deciding what the first steps, how much of the information I want to put on the infographic. So having a framework to follow is really great. And a specific question that I have is, how do you do when you find, let's say, you find a picture that's good from manuscript for an article, and you really like the picture? Um, do you use in your infographic and you put like a reference under it, quote unquote, as the traditional reference style that we use for manuscript? So that's my first question. And the second question is, let's suppose you want to modify this picture. Do you modify it? What do you use for modify it? Let's suppose I want to change the background, or I want to put an extra arrow to the picture.
Yeah. So the things that are created in Canva or a lot of the infographic makers, you don't have to attribute at all. But you're totally right that with journal articles, you have to put a little bit more thought into it. And there's a couple resources that talk about the Creative Commons licensing. For example, like if there's an open access article, those generally are made so that you can reproduce and or edit. So there's like the CC BY. Anyway, so it'll be listed on the journal site. And if you like click through or search which CC license they have, it'll tell you which ones you can reproduce versus reproduce with attribution, reproduce, but you can also edit. I would say for formal things that I do for Febrile, I basically don't use anything unless it's open access and it's that specific license. And generally I always will cite the article. I think there's different things as far as, do you just put the DOI number? Do you put the full information? I sort of wing it. Like if there are, for example, clinical guidelines that I use, I put like the full name of the guidelines and the authors, because I think that's important for people to know. And if it's behind a paywall, I generally like won't use those. I think there are people who do it anyways, but if you're concerned and you don't know, then trying to find an alternate or like creating some sort of alternative option is usually what I'll lean to if it's not in one of those licenses. But hopefully, there are a lot of open access things now that sometimes if there's a really great reference, I'll try and see if there's another version of that somewhere else that you can freely use. So there are a couple, actually in that infographic resource toolkit at the very bottom, I'm pretty sure I think it's a academic medicine last page that talks about Creative Commons license. But also if you Google it, the website will tell you which ones are which. So sometimes can be tricky. If they weren't public facing, it's not like we're like making money off of them, but I always like to be on the cautious side and make it easier for everyone involved. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, I think it's this guy. And then once you start looking for these licenses, I think you'll notice that you always look for them after that. So this last page has the little logos that you'll sometimes see on the print or the PDF versions of the article.
No, that is very, very helpful. Thank you for sharing. All right. That was really great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dong. I'm sure many people have more questions, but out of respect of everyone's time, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really nice to meet everyone. Please email me if you have questions, or if you want someone to look at your graphic as a non-cardiologist, I would be happy to.